Today I'll be walking you through the process of how I created this gray and silver mandala without using any guidelines. On this one, I am painting on a handmade stone, and this stone is made from Ultra Cal 30 and a silicone mold. It just gives me a really nice shape to work with. I've been getting a lot of questions about that, so I have put the links to these items in the description below. I do end up going in and marking where that center dot goes. That just helps me keep it from being like too far to the left or right. Next, I go in to place these first sets of dots. And with this, I always kind of look at my spacing and do like this north, south, east, west to divide it up into 4 equal sections. And then I will just go through and place a dot in between those dots. This helps me to kind of visualize a grid on the stone without there actually being a grid on the stone. And I realized I had enough room to go in and place another dot in between all of those. And I'm also paying attention that the spacing between the dots are the same and that those dots that I am placing actually line up with the dot on the other side of the big gray dot. And doing this is really going to set me up nicely for my mandala. I'll spend a lot of extra time on this first row because everything is going to build off of that first row. So if your spacing is a little bit off in the beginning, by the time you get to the outside of this stone, there's going to be huge gaps on one side while the other side is very tight and close together. Next, I just go in and I'm just placing a dot between the dots of the previous row. And when I'm doing this, I will still skip a dot and end up doing like this north, south, east, west pattern and then placing another one in the middle. And again, this is just helping me with my symmetry, especially since I don't have guidelines. I'm looking across that stone and making sure that all of these dots line up. So when I place these dots, I usually am looking across the stone and placing the dot on the far end of the stone. So that way I can visually see that line working its way from the dot at the lowest point all the way through that center dot to the dot that I'm placing. And this really just, again, just helps with all the symmetry. And it really just gives me guidelines on the stone without there actually being guidelines on the stone, because now everything is just going to line up and I can work my way around. Next, I place these big silver dots, and then I ended up just taking a little needle and just dragging that dot into that space below, creating like these little swipes. And at this point, I've built out that center pretty nicely that I can go in and put a bigger gray dots, and I'm going to start building my petals now. Again, with the placing, I'm doing the same thing I've been doing, the north, south, east, west dot between the previous dots, but I'm also lining it up with those silver dots. And now I have the placement of all my petals. From here, I'm just going to start going in and doing a lot of walking the dots on this piece. But these first dots right here are just as important because I have to make sure to get that little dot right on top of the other dot, or else my mandala will start like kind of leaning to one way or the other. But once I get that first dot on, I can just go in and actually start doing the petals. So I decided to, with the silver, to do like these little swipes where I just like load the tool up with a lot of paint and then just slowly drag it around the dot, creating this swipe effect. For my paint, I am using Liquitex on this one. So this silver is Liquitex, and I just add some pouring medium to it to kind of thin it down. This gives it the right consistency for this artwork. I like my dots to be nice and rounded like that big center dot and not have any peaks in it. But I also want the dot to dry rounded and raised so that it has texture and volume to it. Even once it's dry, it's not going to dry flat. And this is the secret that I've learned, is using thicker paint and then just going in and using the pouring medium really just gives me the perfect paint consistency that I prefer for my artwork. Next, I'm going and placing these dots on top of the petals, and those dots are actually super important as well because to really make sure that they are lining up in a straight line all the way through the stone, because you can have a tendency, or at least I do, to kind of place it off to the side, to like to the right or the left, and then your whole petal will start kind of leaning to one side or the other. So I really take some extra time placing that second dot on top of that big gray dot and making sure that those two really line up really well, because everything else is going to build off of that. And so I need to make sure that those get as close to perfect as possible. And then from here, it becomes much easier for me because now everything is lined up and the process actually speeds up a lot for me. Plus, my dots are getting a lot bigger now. So as I'm working my way out, my tool sizes and everything kind of gradually increase. And this just makes it where I'm now placing bigger dots going around. So the process just kind of speeds up a little bit. And I'm not trying to do like very tiny details in very tiny spots anymore. At this point, as I'm working my way around, I'm noticing that that space between the two petals is getting a lot tighter. So I'm really focusing on my spacing and the size dots that I'm making and deciding how I am going to do the next row. So once I get this section done, I will go and just kind of look at my spacing and see what will fit next. For the next row, I decided to do white. So I'm going from like the darker gray all the way to the white to just kind of to define this petal and to create some depth in the piece. I keep these dots small and let them just kind of fade away into the little space where the two petals meet up. And this just again ends up adding a lot to the depth and keeps the piece looking nice and clean, as you're not trying to squeeze like teeny tiny microscopic dots in between those petals. Just kind of just letting it end there. And then I wanted to definitely bring in the silver again. So I go in and just place these big silver dots at the top, and I decided that on this one I definitely wanted to do swipes again. I had done those little bitty swipes at the very beginning to finish off that center part, and then I had done some silver swipes around the gray dot in the petals. So I wanted to just bring that aspect out to the outside of the stone too. So with this, it's the same idea as before, where I'm just going to load it up with a lot of paint and then just slowly drag it out into the space that I created. And this is going to set me up really nice for the next section. And I'm really paying attention to my spacing too and how much room I have between each petal. I then looked at how much space I have left on the stone and realized I could put another petal in there, but I just needed to push the big dot out a little bit farther. So I put a slightly smaller dot in there, just kind of fill up that space a little bit so I can put a bigger dot on top of it, pushing that whole petal out more towards the outside. Since this part of the stone is curved, I have to make sure my paint is pretty thick, and so when I put these big dots with a lot of paint, it can leave a little peak in there. So I just take a needle and just kind of swirl it around to just kind of smooth it out so that the dot will dry nice and rounded. I usually wait and let those big dots dry just because the way I hold the stone from here on out, I'm always have it in my hand. I can just kind of rotate the stone and move it so that I can get a better angle for placing all of these little tiny dots walking around. So having the big dots dry usually just makes it a little bit easier on me and less chances of me really messing something up. But the whole time I just have to be very mindful of where my hands are at all times to make sure that I'm not just accidentally smearing around a lot of wet paints. For this row of petals, since I didn't have a lot of room, I ended up just kind of starting with the lightest gray and walking my way around and then moving straight into the white, walking the dot. This is just kind of lightening it up a little bit on the sides, but still adding some depth to that dot as it does gradually get darker as you move your way in. When doing this section is where I really just have to be very careful of my placement. A trick I've also learned is if you look, I can put my pinky on the stone. That dot is dry, so I'll place my pinky somewhere where there is no wet paint. Placing my pinky on the stone like this just helps stabilize my hand, keeps it from shaking, and I just have more control of the dotting tool when I do this. It's just making sure you don't touch the wet paint, which sometimes I get so focused that I might actually mess something up. But in the end, I end up getting a better result just kind of taking this risk and placing my finger on the stone. I did want to bring in these swipes here at the end, just kind of bringing the whole first petal out to the last petal and just tying the whole stone together. And then I had this space left over and I decided to just do like these two big gray dots. And with this, my paint is super thick, but as you can see, as I leave it, it just kind of slowly settles in to a nice rounded dot. So I didn't actually go back and have to use the needle to kind of swirl those out at all. They just were able to flatten out on their own. After I do this part, I'll set the stone aside and let it fully dry because next I will be doing top dots, and I need that first layer to be completely dry before I go in and add any of these top dots. So I'm just going to keep using like lighter shades of the gray on top of the dark gray to just kind of brighten up those dots a little bit. And I'm going to end up doing another layer on top of this in the white, kind of just keep the whole pattern going. But I'll have to place all these dots and then once again just set the stone aside and let everything dry before I go in and add the white top dots on top of these. With the top dots, this is the point where you like really start to see the whole piece start to come together and really get a feel for the piece. In the end, I like the choices I made on this one, the dimension that it created, and the depth is something that I really enjoy with this one. And even though like gray and silver are colors I would normally pick out, they're very lovely together and just created a beautiful stone in the end. If you liked watching this video and me explaining my process, please leave me a comment down below. If you have any questions or things you would like me to cover in future voiceovers, just drop them down below, and I've been reading and taking notes on things to discuss in future posts. Thank you so much for watching, and here is going to be the finished piece.